There is an emotion that most people carry every single day and almost never name. It is not sadness, exactly. It is not anxiety, though it can produce anxiety. It is not anger, though it can fuel anger. It is something more foundational than any of those, something that operates below the level of the specific feeling and organizes the entire relationship a person has with themselves. It shows up in the split-second contraction when you make a mistake. In the way you go very quiet when someone criticizes you. In the part of you that does not believe, at the deepest level, that you deserve the good things that come to you. In the exhaustion of performing a version of yourself that you believe is more acceptable than who you actually are. In the persistent, background noise conviction that if people truly knew you, really knew you, they would leave. That is shame. And according to 2 decades of rigorous social science research, it is one of the most significant and most undertreated contributors to mental health struggles, destructive behavior, addiction, relational difficulty, and the specific inability to grow and change that brings so many people to therapy in the first place. Today we are going all the way into it. Shame and its often confused companion, guilt. The difference between them, which turns out to be one of the most consequential distinctions in all of emotional psychology. Where shame comes from, how it becomes chronic, how people respond to it, and what the research consistently shows about how to actually work through it rather than simply suffer inside it. A worksheet for working through both shame and guilt is linked in the description. Let's begin. Section 1. Shame versus guilt. The most important distinction: shame and guilt are used interchangeably in everyday language, and this conflation is not just imprecise. It is clinically consequential, because the two emotions have opposite effects on behavior and on psychological well-being, and because treating one as though it were the other leads to interventions that actively make things worse. The distinction, which has been most rigorously and most accessibly articulated by researcher Brené Brown and grounded in the work of June Price Tangney and other social scientists who have studied these emotions across populations and contexts, is this: guilt says I did something bad. Shame says I am bad. Guilt is about behavior. It is the uncomfortable, evaluative feeling that arises when we recognize that our actions have fallen short of our own values, that we have done something that hurt someone, violated a standard we hold, or failed to do what we knew was right. Guilt is specific, object-focused, and inherently action-oriented. It says, that thing I did was wrong. And from that assessment, it points in a direction, toward repair, accountability, apology, and change. Shame is about identity. It is not an assessment of behavior, it is an assessment of the self. Not I did something wrong but I am wrong. Not I made a mistake but I am a mistake. And this shift from behavior to being changes everything about how the emotion functions. Shame does not point toward repair, because the problem shame is describing is not something that was done, it is something that is. You cannot apologize your way out of being fundamentally defective. You cannot make amends for the crime of existing as who you are. The research on the behavioral consequences of these two emotions is striking. Guilt, across populations and studies, is associated with prosocial behavior. The discomfort of guilt motivates people toward the other person, toward accountability, toward the repair of relationships and the correction of behavior. It produces empathy. The guilt-prone person is thinking about the impact of their actions on others. Shame, by contrast, is associated with anger, blame, aggression, and withdrawal, not because people with high shame don't care about others, but because shame activates such profound psychological pain that the primary response is self-protection rather than outward orientation. You cannot be genuinely accountable when you are flooded with the experience of being fundamentally defective. You are too busy trying to survive the shame to have bandwidth for anyone else. The clinical and practical implication is this: guilt, used well, is a morally and emotionally functional emotion that leads toward growth. Shame, in almost any dose, is a barrier to the very growth it seems to be demanding. Section 2. Where shame comes from. Shame is not innate. It is learned. And it is learned, with devastating efficiency, in the specific relational and social environments that communicate to a person that who they are is unacceptable, insufficient, or dangerous to love. The developmental origins of shame are relational, and they begin early. The infant who is met with consistent attunement, whose expressions of need, distress, and joy are reliably received by a caregiver who mirrors them and responds, develops a foundational sense that their inner world is valid and that they are fundamentally acceptable as they are. The infant whose emotional expressions are met with withdrawal, contempt, indifference, or punishment learns something very different, that aspects of who they are produce dangerous outcomes in the people they need most. And the most efficient way for a developing mind to make sense of that danger is to locate it in the self. There is something about me that causes this response. There is something wrong with me. Explicit shame messages, the parental communication that goes beyond behavior correction into character assassination, are another powerful origin. The difference between "you hit your sister, that was wrong and you are a bad person" is the difference between guilt induction and shame induction. Discipline that targets behavior leaves the child's fundamental self intact. Discipline that targets identity installs the shame message directly into the self-concept, where it lives and compounds across the lifespan. Cultural and social messages contribute a third layer of shame origin that is impossible to fully separate from the individual developmental history. Messages about gender, what it means to be an acceptable man or woman, what emotions are permitted, what needs are appropriate, are profound shame generators. Messages about body, race, class, sexuality, ability, and belonging all carry the potential to communicate, explicitly or implicitly, that some aspect of who a person is places them outside the circle of acceptability. Brown's research identifies specific shame categories: appearance and body image, mental and physical health, sex, money and work, motherhood and fatherhood, family, parenting, aging, religion, surviving trauma, and being stereotyped and labeled as the domains in which people are most reliably and most persistently shamed by their cultures. And shame is transmitted relationally, not just between generations of families but between people in ongoing relationships. A partner whose primary regulatory strategy is contempt installs shame. A peer group that enforces belonging through mockery installs shame. A workplace culture that treats failure as personal deficiency installs shame. Shame does not require dramatic abuse or obvious malice to take root. It requires only repeated, relational communication that some part of the person is not acceptable, and a person who is trying to remain connected to the people delivering that communication. Section 3. The 3 responses to shame, and why only one helps. One of the most practically useful frameworks in Brown's research on shame is her identification of 3 primary ways people respond when shame is activated, 3 strategies the self deploys in the attempt to manage the intolerable pain of the experience of being fundamentally unacceptable. Understanding these responses is essential because they look very different on the outside, they feel very different from the inside, and only one of them actually leads anywhere toward healing. The first response is moving away, withdrawal, hiding, silence, disappearance. The person who moves away in shame becomes invisible. They stop sharing the parts of themselves that have been shamed, they retreat from the relationships and contexts in which the shame was activated, they become smaller and quieter and more private. Moving away feels like self-protection because it is self-protection, the self is withdrawing from the source of the pain. But it also withdraws from the only antidote to shame, connection. Shame thrives in secrecy and silence. The person who disappears into their shame takes it with them into the hiding place, where it grows undisturbed by the only thing that could diminish it. The second response is moving toward, the attempt to manage shame through appeasement, people-pleasing, and earning back acceptance. The person who moves toward in shame becomes hyper-attuned to what others need, highly compliant, excessively apologetic, organized around the project of making themselves acceptable enough that the shame's verdict can be disproven. This response looks, from the outside, like social engagement, and it involves proximity to others. But it is not the kind of proximity that heals shame. It is the proximity of performance, not a genuine vulnerability. The self that moves toward in shame is not sharing itself. It is managing how it is perceived. And shame that is managed rather than exposed does not resolve. The third response is moving against, the conversion of shame's pain into anger, blame, contempt, and aggression directed outward. The person who moves against in shame does not collapse inward or perform their way to acceptance. They attack. The shame, which is the experience of being defective, is converted into rage at whoever or whatever triggered the activation, or projected outward onto others who are then identified as the defective ones. Moving against shame is the response most associated with interpersonal harm. The contemptuous partner, the rageful manager, the parent whose shame about their own failures produces cruelty toward a child who reminds them of it. It is also, paradoxically, the response that keeps the shame most completely protected from the healing it needs, because the aggression creates the very relational rupture that ensures the vulnerability at shame's center is never safely exposed. All three responses make complete sense as strategies for surviving the acute pain of shame activation. None of them heal the shame. The response that actually leads somewhere, what Brown calls shame resilience, involves something different from all three. It moves toward vulnerability and connection rather than away from them, and it does so in the specific way that the research identifies as the antidote to shame. Section 4. Chronic shame. When it becomes the water you swim in for many people, shame is not an occasional acute experience that arises in specific triggering situations. It is a chronic, ambient state, the background radiation of their emotional life, so constant and so familiar that it has become indistinguishable from simply how it feels to be them. Chronic shame, what clinicians sometimes call toxic shame, building on John Bradshaw's foundational work, is the shame that has been so thoroughly internalized, so consistently reinforced, and so deeply woven into the self-concept that it no longer requires a triggering event to activate. It is simply the person's default relationship with themselves, a persistent, baseline conviction of fundamental defectiveness that colors the interpretation of every experience, every relationship, and every evaluation of the self. The clinical presentations of chronic shame are varied and often indirect, which is part of why shame is so frequently the hidden driver of conditions that present as something else entirely. Depression, in which the primary feature is not sadness but a pervasive sense of worthlessness and the conviction that nothing will ever be genuinely good, is often shame-driven depression. Perfectionism, the relentless, never-satisfied pursuit of flawless performance, is most accurately understood as the behavioral expression of chronic shame, the endless attempt to be enough by doing enough. Addiction, as explored extensively by both Brown and by Patrick Carnes in his work on betrayal bonding, is one of the most well-documented consequences of chronic shame, the substance or behavior providing temporary relief from the intolerable pain of the shame state. Anger and contempt in relationships, as noted in the previous section, are frequently shame's defensive armor. And the inability to receive love, care, or positive feedback, the reflexive disqualifying of compliments, the suspicion of care, the conviction that if someone truly knew you they would withdraw, is the relational signature of chronic shame that is most heartbreaking to witness from the outside. For therapists, chronic shame is often not what the client names as the presenting problem. It shows up in the way they talk about themselves, in the quality of self-reference in their narrative, in the relationship to the therapist, how much they apologize, how hard they work to be a good client, how shame-flooded their response is to any perception of having disappointed. Naming the shame, gently, precisely, with the explicit reframe that there is nothing wrong with who they are, is often the most important clinical intervention available. Not because naming it resolves it, but because naming it makes it visible and therefore workable, which is where the healing begins. Section 5. Working through guilt, the path that actually leads somewhere. Guilt, unlike shame, is an emotion worth sitting with, because guilt, when it is genuinely about behavior rather than about identity, is the emotion that leads toward the repair and accountability that actually allow a person to grow and to remain in genuine relationship with their own values. The first step in working through guilt productively is making the distinction that matters most: is this actually guilt, or is this shame wearing guilt's clothing? The question to ask is whether the distress is focused on a specific behavior, a thing that was done or not done, or whether it has globalized into an evaluation of the self. I feel terrible about what I said to her is guilt. I am a terrible person is shame. This distinction is not always immediately clear, and many people move fluidly between the two in the same thought sequence. But locating the actual focus of the painful feeling is the first step toward addressing it in the way that actually helps. Genuine guilt, the discomfort of having done something that violated your own values, calls for a specific sequence. First, acknowledgement. Naming what happened, to yourself and where appropriate to the person affected, with full honesty and without minimizing or deflecting. Not "I'm sorry you felt hurt, but I did a hurtful thing and I'm sorry." The distinction matters both for the relationship and for the person's own integrity, because accountability that hedges or deflects does not produce the resolution that genuine acknowledgement does. Second, repair, where repair is possible and appropriate. Making amends is not about eliminating the guilt through transactional exchange, it is about restoring something in the relationship and in the self that the harmful behavior damaged. And repair is not always available. Sometimes the person has died, sometimes the relationship is not one that should be resumed, sometimes the harm was too significant for the injured party to receive repair from the person who caused it. Where repair is not possible externally, the work of repair shifts inward, toward the internal relationship with the self and one's own values. Third, learning and commitment. Guilt that simply cycles, acknowledge, repair, feel temporarily better, repeat the same behavior, feel guilty again, is not guilt being worked through. It is guilt being managed. Working through guilt requires engaging genuinely with the question, what does this tell me about where my behavior and my values are not aligned, and what specific, different choice am I committing to going forward? This is the growth function of guilt, and it is the reason that healthy guilt, engaged with honestly, makes people more ethical and more relational rather than simply more miserable. Section 6. Healing shame. What the research says works. Shame heals in the exact opposite conditions from those in which it was created. It was created in isolation, secrecy, and the experience of being fundamentally unacceptable to the people whose acceptance was most needed. It heals in connection, vulnerability, and the experience of being seen in the shame and met with empathy rather than judgment. Brown's research identifies this as the core mechanism of shame resilience, the move from shame to empathy. Not the suppression of shame, not the arguing away of shame, not the performance of enoughness in the attempt to disprove shame, but the bringing of the shame into relationship with another person who can receive it without flinching and offer back the experience of being seen and still accepted. This is why Brown's most quoted insight is so precisely correct: shame cannot survive being spoken. Not because speaking it magically eliminates it, but because the act of speaking shame to the right person, someone who responds with empathy rather than judgment, directly contradicts the core shame message. The shame says, if you knew this about me you would leave. The empathic other says, I know this about you and I am still here. And that contradiction, experienced in a real relationship with a real person, is neurologically and psychologically the most powerful thing available. Self-compassion, Kristin Neff's framework, which we have discussed in other videos in this series, is the internal version of the same mechanism. Self-compassion asks the person to offer themselves the same warmth, understanding, and recognition of shared humanity that they would offer a friend who came to them with the same experience. The shame-prone person treats their own pain with contempt and demands. Self-compassion treats it with kindness and recognition. This is painful, this is part of being human, and I deserve the same care I would offer someone else in this moment. The research on self-compassion and shame is unambiguous. Self-compassion reduces shame and its behavioral consequences more effectively than self-esteem building approaches, because self-compassion does not depend on being good enough, only on being human. Identifying and challenging shame narratives, the specific stories shame tells about the self, is the cognitive dimension of shame healing. What is the specific message? Where did it come from? Who said it, or communicated it, or enforced it? Is it the truth about who you are, or is it the truth about an environment you had to survive? This examination does not eliminate shame immediately. Shame is held in implicit memory and body sensation as much as in narrative, and it is not primarily a cognitive phenomenon. But bringing the narrative into conscious examination begins the process of loosening its grip, of creating enough distance between the self and the story that the story can be evaluated rather than simply inhabited. And boundaries, the clarity about what is and is not acceptable in the relationships and contexts that have been sources of shame, are part of the longer-term structural work of healing. Shame that is continuously reinforced by the same environment cannot heal. Part of what sustainable shame resilience requires is the reduction of the ongoing shame inputs, the relationships in which contempt is the primary currency, the environments in which aspects of who you are consistently treated as unacceptable, the internal voices that are direct transmissions of external shame messages that have been internalized. The worksheet in the description provides structured prompts for this work, both the healing of existing shame and the building of the self-understanding and resilience that reduce vulnerability to it going forward. Shame says you are not enough. That if people truly knew you they would leave. That the only safe move is to hide, or to perform, or to attack before you can be attacked. That the pain you are feeling is accurate information about your fundamental worth as a human being. None of that is true. Every single part of it is the emotional residue of a specific history, specific relationships, specific environments, specific moments when the people or the culture around you communicated something about who you are that you were not yet equipped to challenge. It was installed before you had the language to question it. And it has been running, largely unchallenged, since. Guilt, when it is genuine, is a compass. It points toward the gap between who you are and who you want to be, and it asks you to close it. That discomfort is worth having. It is worth listening to. It leads somewhere. Shame, in the doses most people carry it, does not lead anywhere. It circles. It contracts. It costs people years of their lives and relationships and the experience of being genuinely known by anyone who matters to them. And it heals, not through harder self-criticism, not through earning enough or achieving enough or performing enough, but through the terrifying, liberating act of being seen in it. By someone who stays. The worksheet is in the description, structured prompts for examining and working through both shame and guilt, for yourself and for the clients you sit with who are carrying more of this than they have ever had language for. Share this video with someone who needs to know that what they are carrying is not the truth about who they are. And I will see you in the next one.